Excellent. Okay, let me just make Sarah a co-host. Wonderful. Okay, we are all ready to go. Our two speakers are here. So let me introduce them to you. So first, Lucy Frith, a reader in bioethics and social science at the University of Liverpool in the Institute of Population Health. Lucy's research sits at the interface of bioethics, medical sociology, and health services research, and she focuses on improving healthcare decision-making and policy with a particular interest in combining empirical methods with ethical analysis. And of course, we listened to Jonathan Ives yesterday, so a great area of combining empirical research and bioethics. And Lucy does have has particular expertise in empirical ethics, qualitative research methods, and public patient involvement in research, service design, and health policy. We're also very delighted to have Dr. Sarah Chan, a Reader and Chancellor's Fellow here at the University of Edinburgh. And Sarah is based in the Usher Institute, which has been doing fantastic work, of course, particularly in COVID-19 studies recently. Sarah has a wide range of interests in the ethics of medical research, including stem cells, embryo research, and reproductive medicine, human enhancement, gene therapy, and genetic modification, along with animal ethics and research ethics. So we are absolutely delighted to have them both to offer some tips and their own experiences with writing grant applications. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to both Sarah and Lucy.
Thanks very much, Ted, and thank you for this wonderful event and organising it, as well as inviting us to speak. I've realised, so you can see through Sarah Chan's, because Lucy's joined using my Zoom link, I assume. Sorry about that, Lucy. I'm not sure if you can rename yourself. Great. So can everybody see my slides? I have somehow managed to get myself into a Zoom window where I can't see my slides, but as long as I can advance them, that's probably going to be okay. So we thought...
Slideshow, Sarah.
Yeah, it's what's happened with Zooms that I actually don't see, and I can't find the window that's got them back. But anyway, technical issues. We thought we'd start by actually getting a feel for the group and seeing. So this session is about writing grants, but we thought we'd ask how many of you have some experience already of applying for grants. Now I don't know in this webinar rather than meeting format whether people have access to any reaction buttons. Can you raise your hands or click yes, no?
Yeah, there is a reaction. I believe people have the reaction in the bottom of their Zoom, thumbs up. So maybe a thumbs up could be the reaction if they have experience with writing grant applications, or of course in the chat box just to write.
Yeah, so please let us know how many of you have some previous experience with grant writing. Yeah, quite a few. And quite a few people are new to grant writing as well. Of those of you who have been involved in writing grants, how many people have had success with grant writing in the past? Yeah, so someone says I'm self-funded, so I'm new to grant writing. Yeah, so many of you may have received funding for your PhD proposals, but quite a lot of people are new to grants. So if I do this, does this advance the slides for you as well? I really hope so. Lucy, can you tell me what you can see? I had to go in the PowerPoint window to do this.
Yeah, we can see the
slides
and tell us about your experiences.
Yeah, great.
Great, thanks.
Okay, so I guess the first thing to say about that, so some of you have previous experience, some of you have actually got grants, some of you are completely new, that's all fine. Well done, not only to those who have successfully got grants, but to those who, even if you attempted and submitted a grant proposal and you weren't successful, well done on that as well, because it's a significant task. It's a big achievement just to get a grant written, even if you don't get funding. And we'll talk a little bit more about grant success rates and what the implications of that are for how you think about your own grant writing strategy within your career. But yeah, as you can see, not all grants, not everyone who writes a grant will get that funding. And that's part of what we've got to think about when we consider for any funding opportunity, whether or not we're going to go for it and put something together. Okay, so for those of you who, have written grants in the past, or for those of you who are thinking about writing a grant, what are some of the reasons? So why did you apply for the grants that you did, or for those who are thinking of it? What are your reasons for wanting to apply for grants? Jump into the chat box and just let us know some of your thoughts. We do want this session to be quite interactive, by the way, so feel free to give us reactions as responses to things. Feel free to jump in the chat. If you do want to say something live rather than in the chat box, then I don't know if you can unmute yourselves, but if you can't, raise your hand and we can come to you to bring you in. Yeah, so we're getting a few responses. So in the chat, so Richard says someone needs to pay me to do my work. So you have research, you want to do it, someone has to pay your salary. So at the career stage that a lot of you are at the moment, the reasons you may be applying for funding might include bringing in a salary or funding for yourself. Similarly, Emily said to secure a position for beyond a time of postdoc. So that's both, I suppose, the sorts of funding that might lead to permanent posts. And we're going to talk a bit later on about what the different types of funding are and how you might think about applying for those at career stages, what's appropriate when. But there's also, Michelle's pointed out, career progression, being able to develop your own research PhD funding, to do research on something you want to do. So you have an idea, you want to research it, apply for money. Expenses, so what Ted suggested, Rachel has said expenses for research materials and costs, so travel for interviewing, or to be able to concentrate on your research, whether it's your PhD research or you're generating the funding for a salaried position. Okay, so when we were thinking about what are some of the reasons that we've applied for grants in the past and why might people be interested in applying for funding. So I think the purest reason, if you like, for applying for grants is I have an idea, I need some resources to do it. And that might be anything from I want a small travel grant to go to a conference, it might be applying for research costs, it might be bringing your own salary, or it might be a major project where you're actually bringing in money to employ other people. Of course, there might also be someone else has an idea and is offering resources. And over the last year, we've seen a lot of funding for COVID-related ideas, and we've seen a lot of researchers, myself and colleagues included, thinking about, well, this needs doing, is it something that I could do? And we'll talk a bit later on as well about the appropriateness of applying for different grants. Just because there's money on offer for it, should you bid for it? Are you the right person, and is this the right funding for you? Something that we haven't really mentioned in the chat so far, but that you might think about is funding to help catalyse collaboration or consolidate connections. So things like network grants, money for more extended research travel, for research exchanges. There are a lot of international partnership type of grants that you might look at applying for to develop partnerships and collaborations with other countries. And as a couple of people have pointed out, sometimes it's perceived, in fact, let's be honest, often it's perceived that grant writing and grant getting is necessary for career development. And again, we're going to reflect a little bit towards the end of the session on how you not just plan a strategy for writing a given grant, but how you make grant writing part of a successful academic career. Or perhaps you don't need to write grants, and we'll reflect on that. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Lucy now, who's going to talk a little bit more about some of the different types of grants there are and when and how and under what circumstances you might want to apply for those. So Lucy, I'll hand over to you now. I'll go on mute.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Well, it's a huge topic, grant writing, and I think we're only going to be able to skim over the main, not really touch on everything. But I think for this audience, one important thing to think about is going for appropriate types of grants for your career level. So whereas in medicine and other more straightforwardly scientific disciplines, there's often quite a clear progression of funding streams that you can go to. So for the National Institute of Health Research in the UK, they fund doctoral students, then they fund postdocs, and they have a very clear career progression that you can work through their funding streams. In bioethics particularly, there isn't the same kind of structure. So it's worth thinking about that you're going to target your grant writing if you're going to do it. As Sarah said, I think that we also need, particularly in our area, to think about the opportunity costs of applying for grants, because putting a grant in of any size, or even a very small one, is a considerable amount of work, and therefore you need to balance that against other competing demands. So I think it's important to think of the kinds of grants you're going to go for your appropriate career stage. And grants, unlike papers and other kinds of academic publications, are also looking at you as an individual and how good you are going to be at spending their money. Often grant bodies are investing a lot of money in a program, and they want to make sure that the money they give you is going to be used appropriately, it's going to be used effectively, etc. So there's probably one of the big things that differentiates grants from other kinds of academic endeavour is it is also about you and your track record. So you need to pitch your grant writing at the right level. So if you're a PhD student, you don't want to be going for a big £8 million programme grant, because they'll probably think that's inappropriate. So starting small and working up, so a travel grant, a conference grant, and so on. And I think the other thing to think about is what kinds of things further this kind of career and how they fit into our disciplinary norms. And I think that's one thing Sarah and I are going to be stressing throughout the presentation, is it's really important to talk to people, both your colleagues, but also your line managers, to get advice on the right types of things to be applying, and rather than going online and looking at all the possible grants you could do, have a really focused and targeted approach. But we'll talk more about the specifics of grant writing after we're going to do some small group work now. But I think it's worth thinking about what do I actually need money for? And we mustn't also lose sight of the importance of low cost work, that often, particularly in more bioethics areas, you actually just need time rather than resources to do things. So it's thinking about exactly what you want the money for and how that fits into your overall career development and strategy. And that's something that you need to talk to your line managers about very carefully before embarking on a huge piece of work writing a grant, which even with the best will in the world, most schemes have a 20% funding success rate at best. So I think those are some of the things to bear in mind. So I'll hand back to Sarah for our small group work, and then we'll come back and talk a bit more about the specifics.
So what we actually wanted to do was to get you thinking about what's the sort of grant that you might embark on writing now. And for some of you, I know we've got a range of different early career stages here. So some of you might actually be thinking about writing a PhD proposal. Some of you might be doing your PhD. Some of you might be looking at applying for, say, postdoctoral fellowships, or maybe even starting to apply for slightly larger awards. Now, what I realised, Lucy, I'm sorry about this, what I realised is that in the version of Zoom that we're using, so because we're in a webinar rather than a meeting, I can't actually put people into small groups. What we had wanted to get you to do was to work in sort of groups of 4 and tell each other about your ideas. But what I think it would be still quite good to do would be take a moment now, so take, let's say, 5 minutes. We're going to put some questions up on the screen. And I'll get everybody just to take, say, 3 to 5 minutes to quickly jot down some ideas around this, and then feel free to share your thoughts about that in the chat. think first of all about what sort of funding right now you're interested in applying for. And I would say for those of you who haven't yet had any experience of grant writing, and if you're at a PhD stage, definitely what Lucy said about start small and establish a track record of funding is very important. Because let's say you finish your PhD and then you go into a postdoc on someone else's project, maybe you do a couple of postdocs, then maybe you get a permanent position, and then you think, well, I want to apply for funding as a PI for a big project with 5 postdocs. If you have no track record of funding up to that point, as Lucy said, it's going to be much more difficult to establish yourself as a credible prospect. So I would say all of you could apply for funding now. You may not need to, and we'll talk about that. But if you were to apply for something, let's say next week, next month, maybe towards the end of the year, what sort of thing would you apply for? So how do you go from the good idea to the grant application? Just take 5 minutes or so now to think about what could I write a grant for? Put to one side whether or not you really want to do it. We'll share those reflections later on as well. But if you were to write a grant, what would you be doing? What's the research question? Why is it important? And for grants, you also need to be able to say, what will the answers lead to? So what's that dreaded I word, impact? What will be the impact of answering the research question? Think about what you'll do to answer that question, and here be as specific and detailed as you can. Try to think about how long it's going to take you realistically. How will you know you're getting there? Then think about why you need the grant to do it. So you've got the research question, you know what you want to do. Why do you need money? What are you going to spend it on? Why are those expenses necessary and good value? So just take, I'll give you, I'll say three minutes, and as we kind of come back to it, to feedback and wrap up, I'm sure some of you can take a little bit longer. So just take a few minutes now to reflect about this and think about what grant might I write next. While you're doing this as well, or indeed at any time, if anybody has questions or comments or reflections that they'd like to share, as I said, do please feel free to participate in the chat. We want to hear from you as well on your thoughts and your questions. Okay, 3 minutes is a very short time, of course. I'll just give you a little bit more time. If people are ready to start sharing some of their ideas, and I hope this is all right, by the way. Nobody is forced to share, but you know, I would also say this is it should be a safe space. I don't think that people should feel that you're not going to be judged because your 3-minute grant application was a little bit vague around the edges at all. I will point out, of course, and we're going to come on to some of the nuts and bolts and what you need to do in preparing to write a grant. Having the idea is definitely the easy part. But yeah, would people like to start sharing? Even if you didn't get all the way through the questions, has anyone had any thoughts about what kind of grant they might apply for next for a start? Applying for travel grants at the moment, of course, is probably not the most secure prospect. Anybody like to share either in the chat or I can unmute people, or even if you can't unmute yourselves, if you would like to contribute. Great. Thanks very much, Rebecca and Zara, for chipping in there. I know some of you may still be thinking, that's absolutely fine. Yeah, so and I hope people don't mind if we discuss these just as examples a little bit. So Rebecca, this sounds like a great idea, a grant to make a podcast about doing a PhD. Why do you need the money? You need to have a professional editor. I want to fund this. I think this would be great. I'm not a grant funder. Okay, who might you apply for? Sorry, who might you apply to for a grant like that? So this is not quite your standard, say, research fellowship funding, but there are funders who offer money for engagement. They're often special initiatives. So this, why do we need a podcast about doing a PhD? That would be something that your funders might ask you. So you have to come up with a rationale as to why do people need to hear what it's like doing a PhD. I think an obvious way to try and spin this might be to look, for example, at the funders who are funding major doctoral training centres. They're thinking not just about individual projects, but about PhD education and having an impact there. So maybe they'd be funders from that. A lot of other people said, yes, so Zara, research grant post PhD, so that's a very standard research fellowship. And where Lucy talked about there being less of a defined funding career trajectory in bioethics, that is true, but at the same time, if you've a standard model that we would often see, and I say this as someone who sat on funding committees, would be someone who's, let's say, maybe had a funded PhD, maybe not, might have got some small funding during that time, then might go for a postdoctoral research fellowship. Usually, you would probably want to go for maybe some of the slightly smaller, shorter schemes rather than straight for bang a 3-year award, although it can work. And you might have, let's say, so in social science, for example, there are a number of 1-year postdoc fellowships that essentially help you to capitalise on your PhD work. Then you might go for, say, the Wellcome Trust 3-year fellowship. Then you might look at something like a Wellcome University Award or the current UKRI Future Leaders Scheme that eventually looks at setting you up for a permanent position. Yeah, good. Alana, also postdoc funding. Oh, is it better to focus on getting the thesis done and then focus on the grant when waiting for the Bible, or to have it lined up before finishing? So I think it depends which scheme you are going for. As I say, something like the Wellcome Trust postdoctoral research fellowship scheme, I don't think I have ever seen anybody, maybe occasionally someone will get one of those straight out of their PhD. If they do, it will usually be someone who's published quite a lot during their PhD and might have done their PhD part-time while also having a research job. So someone with more research experience. If you've just come straight into a PhD, done that in 3 years, I would say it's very unlikely you'd get a big fellowship like that straight out of the box. If you were thinking of going for, let's say, a 1-year to, so a lot of the 1-year ones, I think some of the ESRC ones might be suitable depending on what your research project is. They could be suitable for people in empirical bioethics or in some of the areas of medical law. That actually kind of follows on from your PhD, so it's not starting an entirely new project. In general, I would say to PhD students at any stage, is it better to focus on getting the thesis done or something else? Get your thesis done. And I say this as somebody who took a very long time to get my thesis done. Get your thesis done. Early career buyout. This is a different type of grant we haven't really talked so much about. So this is Joseph says applying for an early career buyout. Yeah, so the other thing we can do once we are in a position, you might be in a teaching research position, but you might want to buy out some of your teaching time so you can focus more on research. At a very sort of early stage of being in a permanent position, I would actually say I don't know if that's the best idea, because you do want to establish yourself as a rounded academic. I mean, if the idea comes along and the perfect scheme comes along, okay, go for it. But I would say, Lucy, you might have different advice on this. I would say your first year or two in a permanent post, work on establishing yourself in that post, rather than immediately coming in and going, yeah, but I'm going to get a grant and buy myself out and not actually do any of the teaching that I was hired to do. That would be my suggestion. Lucy, do you have any other thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's a good point, because, and again, this reflect, I mean, bioethicists can be in a variety of different departments and faculties. So I will keep stressing this, but I do think it's important to make sure that you're doing the kind of things that are very valued in your particular setting. And in certain settings, that may be that you bring in funding. In other settings, it may be that you develop and consolidate your teaching, and particularly with first posts, when you're often required to get a teaching qualification, that might be the better focus initially. But again, those kind of questions very much, if you're in a more humanities, social science faculty, then often the model is that you get brought out of your teaching. But as Sarah said, if you're a new lecturer, they probably wouldn't be very pleased with that. So it's making sure you're doing the right thing at the right time for your career, not simply getting, funding or not getting funding. It's a hard question to answer, but you need to look at your context.
Great, we have some other responses. So Emily is thinking of applying for a research networking grant to build a networking on a symposium. So some of the good schemes for this, the AHRC, I don't know if there are any open at the moment, but I've had a network grant from the AHRC before. You can also often find sort of little bits of money that might come up ad hoc from funders. So keep an eye out for calls. The major funders that we tend to think of going to, of course, are UKRI, particularly AHRC and ESRC for bioethics and medical law. The Wellcome Trust, the British Academy is another one, and they also have fellowships that are appropriate for medical law and bioethics, and that you might want to go for after your PhD. But there are also other sorts of funders who may only have certain grants that are appropriate. But for example, I've recently had a grant from the Great Britain Sasakawa Foundation, which I imagine most of you probably haven't heard of, because they don't mostly fund bioethics. What they fund is research activity that promotes academic collaboration between the UK and Japan. So if you had research that, for example, I don't think, Emily, this is what your network is necessarily about, but if it were a network that had to do with the UK-Japan collaboration, they would specifically be a good funder for that. So have a look as well at whether there are specific funders whose remit, whose purview matches up with what it is you want to do. Another example would be Cancer Research UK. Obviously fund things related to cancer research, but not otherwise. Great. Rachel, you've got actually already a really well thought out you've done amazingly in 3 minutes, identifying your research question, what you're going to do. You've got a timeline. Great. Well, best of luck with the PhD scholarship application. And yeah, as you say, if you need additional money for the research costs, not just for your PhD stipend, then you could look at applying for funding to cover those. Great. Best of luck. I think that sounds really good. Michelle, gene editing on embryos and regulation. Yeah, really, really interesting. Obviously, it's an area of research interest for myself. Have you had any thoughts? And I don't expect you to answer this now, but this is the area of research. The question, I suppose, is how should we regulate the use of gene editing in embryos? Have you thought about how you're going to investigate that question? What do you need the money for? Is it just for your time to think about the socio-legal analysis, or are you going to do empirical research? So you need to think about all of these things to work out what it is you're going to do and why you need the money. Okay, great. Yeah, Alana, the scheme that I was referring to was the Future Leaders Fellowship. I'll just type that in the chat now. They're quite big grants. So the other thing to think about is not just whether it's an appropriate grant for career stage, but also what's the effort versus the payoff. UKRI grants tend to be pretty high effort, so there's a lot of forms to fill out. You've got to write a 6 or 8 or sometimes 12-page case for support. You have to write justification for resources. There's a lot of documentation. Wellcome Trust Fellowships, I think you write your proposal and it's 3,000 words. And that's both a good thing because it's only 3,000 words and a bad thing because you've only got 3,000 words to say all of that stuff about why your proposal is important. So they can be also a lot of effort just to get it down to 3,000 words. There are some, so the Seed Awards scheme, which I don't think they've currently got open, but that's some of the easiest funding that I've ever got. It was a 1,000 words proposal, and you can't say very much in 1,000 words. So I think I put that one together in about a week and we got the money. So that's really the easiest value for the payoff for the cost of the time that I put into it that I've ever had. Lucy, do you have any more examples that you want to share? You're on mute.
Sorry, you'd think I'd have learnt by now, wouldn't you? I think you're right, Sarah. I think sometimes, yeah, and the hardest grants I've ever done are the EU ones. They are particularly complex and Byzantine. But there's often, it's deceptively easy to think I've only got 1,000 words, but even in an outline or an abstract, you do need to know what you're doing. So sometimes when funders suggest you do an outline, it's tempting to think, oh, well, that's quite easy to put in. I can work out the details later. But it's, as you know, in order to summarize something, you need to know exactly what you're going to do. So I think, again, it's just stressing that you're making sure that this is the right thing to do at the right time and, you know, where to put your efforts in. But different funders have different approaches and different application forms, and therefore, obviously, and this is, you know, very basic, but you do need to look at the scheme very carefully you're applying for and make sure that you're putting everything in the right way, in the right forms and in the right place and so on. And different systems differ a lot, although there seems to be a bit more coming together of similar software for grant applications now, but nevertheless, quite often they are very different systems.
That's a good point on which actually to move on to our next section, which is talking about the nuts and bolts of how do you do it. Just before we do that, to address Amy's question, would a smaller grant to host an event to discuss a question with other academics that might, absolutely. So workshop grants are definitely available and they're something that's very gettable, particularly by people at an early career stage. So yeah, that would be a great place to start. One of the problems I always have with these smaller grants though, is building those into the bigger ones. So for example, sometimes I've had small amounts of seed money that actually just end up, you have the workshop, you put together the special issue or the edited collection, you write a bigger application to keep working together, but you don't actually get that money. So sometimes, you get to a certain point and then you get a bit stuck, but definitely workshop grants are very much something you could apply for. some great advice from Anne-Marie in the chat as well about practice and also about collaborating with senior colleagues, which I think we're going to talk a bit about as well. Okay, so Lucy, I'll hand over to you to talk through this section.
Thank you. So do you want to move the slides on, Sarah? Thanks. Okay, I'll put a link, the name of a book that I found very useful for grant writing in the chat in a minute. But as I said, first of all, it's very important to look at what the individual funders require. And I think one of the frustrating things about grants is that often, unlike a paper, when you can submit it somewhere, your first choice journal, they knock it back, you can submit it somewhere else. Grants, although some of it you can repurpose less of it, because a lot of it is a very specific thing you need to write for a particular call or a particular funder. So I think the first thing to stress, and I think one thing that I learned probably, well, I've learned most things the hard way, but particularly this, is that grant proposals are not like research papers. They're not like PhDs. They're not really like anything else you've written. They're a document to sell something. So they're a pitch, they're a sales pitch. And as academics, we're probably not so good at the sales pitch side of our work. So they're not to tell the grant funding body that you know everything there is to know about this area. And that's something that you often notice with grants, that they spend some novices spend a lot of time talking about the background, why the project's important. So I think it's very important to think of it as a sales document. Now, that doesn't mean it has to be very crass, but on the other hand, it has to be written in a way that is easily understandable by lay people, because I think that's the other thing to recognize, is that big funding panels are made up of people, most of whom won't be specialists in your area. They may not even be bioethicists, they may not be social scientists, they may not be lawyers. And even if they are, they may not know anything about your particular funding area. So Sarah's area of research, stem cell research, you might be getting it reviewed by someone who only has a lay knowledge. So you need to walk the tightrope between appealing to the reviewers that they send the grant out to, who will be experts in the field. So convincing them that you know what you're talking about, but also being able to convey it to the panel in lay terms, and so that you can convince people who aren't experts that this is important too. So you need to be aware of your different audiences in a grant application and have, in a sense, something for both levels. So I think the second thing is to stress is peer review, and grants take a long time in my experience, and maybe that's I'm a slow worker, but anything I've ever got funded, and a huge amount of work has gone into it. And peer review can be colleagues, can be friends. I mean, for instance, I've just started a big ESRC grant, and one of the people who was really helpful was one of the professional services research people who read my application. They didn't know anything about the subject, but they gave me really good advice on, oh, I don't understand this bit. Could you, foreground your research question more clearly? Because one of the things is, when you're immersed in writing a grant, you know what you're trying to do, and it's often hard to know if you're conveying that properly. So I'd say try and get it looked at by as many people as possible, both senior colleagues, junior colleagues, etc. The other things are thinking about who you have on the grant, what kind of collaborations you want, and this will obviously depend on the type of grant you're going for, etc. So I'm aware of time, so I'll just run through these. And so I think there's collaborating, thinking about building your team if you're at that stage for a grant, but that might be the kind of grants that you're not necessarily thinking of at the moment. but it's worth thinking about who you'd want to collaborate with and bring in. And importantly, research methods. I think one of the things I notice when I'm reviewing grants is that people are often a bit circumspect about what you need to tell people what you're going to do quite quickly in a grant application, so that people are quite aware of what this is. So rather than spending a lot of time, as I said, setting out the context, you want to tell people that this is going to be a study or a piece of work that will look at this and what it will actually do. And then, of course, what benefits it will produce. So I think it's important to think about methods and be very clear about your methods and making sure they're the appropriate methods for your research question. And of course, grant bodies, as I said, they're giving you money, so they want to know that their money will be well used. So it's important to think about your grant and is it feasible? Sometimes you can you can say you're going to do this huge amount of work for a very small amount of money, will make people think you haven't really thought it through or you don't really understand the process. Correspondingly, asking for £1 million, to write a short article might not seem good value for money. So funders are always concerned about good value for money. And so therefore, you need to think about costings. So finally, I think, as I said, it's important to look at the requirements for the funders, what you need, specifications, deadlines. And I think most importantly is one thing that I wasn't aware of when I started is the amount of bureaucracy that sits behind grant writing that your university requires you to do. So for instance, there are often internal deadlines for signing off grant applications. And if you've never done a grant application, you may not be aware of it. So for instance, and this varies across institutions, but some institutions require internal peer review before they'll let you submit a grant. Some grant applications require 2 weeks before to sign off the finance. So it's worth, if you are thinking of applying for any external funding, being quite clear on your own institution's procedures for getting this through. So there's a lot of admin involved in a grant. There's the intellectual work, but then there's just the pure endless emails to lots of different departments, ensuring you're getting everything on the right forms in the right time. And part of that will be costings. So we have something called a research office at Liverpool. I'm sure obviously your institutions will have something similar. And you need to get them to cost your grants because they will know how to do all the things like direct, indirect costs, full economic costing, the dreaded FEC, as Sarah's called it. And all these things that you can't do yourselves, you need to get the person who will deal with your finance involved in that. So I think that's something, if you've never applied for a grant externally, you may not be aware of, and that all takes time. So you almost need to start, if there is a grant deadline, start from the deadline and work backwards in terms of submitting a grant to your institutional sign-off pool is not submitting it to the funder. And so for UKRI Council grants, you have to go through an online submission process that goes to your institution sign off and then to the funder. So you need to build in all that time to when you're thinking about, particularly if there's a call with a deadline, and be realistic about that. So I'll stop there, but it's very important to think about the admin side of it.
Okay, so we wanted to have a bit of time at the end to reflect and also to open to more questions. So we thought we'd, the last section of the session would be to think about, you've written the grant, well, what happens next? What happens when you get the grant? Well, that's a whole another story about having to administer and report and successfully deliver, etc. But the first thing, if you get the grant, clearly open the champagne or break out the cupcakes or whatever. But what happens when you don't get the grant? Because, as Lucy said earlier, for most schemes, it's maybe a 20% success rate. For a lot of schemes, it's even less. So I will tell you one way to get research grants is to start by not getting a lot of research grants. Last year, I think I wrote 5 and I got 1. So yeah, the way to get grants is also you're going to have, unless you're extremely lucky, and I say lucky rather than good because there is a lot of luck involved in it. Unless you're extremely lucky, getting grants is also going to involve times when you don't get the grant. So what happens next? And this is where we wanted to reflect on, as we talked about earlier, the opportunity costs. It takes a long time. I hope what we've just run through with you has given you ideas and inspiration and some of the necessary tools to approach grant writing, but I hope it's also given you the idea that it's not to be done lightly. So it's often time consuming, it's not that easy, and you might not succeed. Every time I don't get a grant, I'm not very resilient. I'm actually pretty bad at resilience. And I say to myself, I probably should not write so many grants because, you know, it's very personal. I take it very personally when I don't get them. Some people are able more easily to shrug it off, and you know, being resilient as an academic is important. But I also always think, you know, if I put together all the grants that I've written and didn't get, if I put together all the work and the intellectual lifting, not to mention the time that I had spent on those, I would probably have been able to write like 3 monographs in that time. It's a lot of time. So there is a big opportunity cost, and you have to weigh up, is it worth it? Both to you personally, in terms of what it will cost you. What will you not do with that time if you write this grant? What will it cost you personally if you don't get it? How will you respond to that? Will you be able to do anything with the work you've put in? So sometimes, you know, grants that I haven't got, I've at least done so much background research that I've been able to write, I guess, what would have been the first paper, the conceptual paper, if you like, the research agenda paper. Had I got the grant, I'm able to write that anyway, so I get something out of it. But yeah, do think about how will you respond? How will you feel if you don't get it? I don't know, Lucy, are you any more resilient than me? I'm bad at handling failures. But.
I think I think what encourages me is, you know, there's quite a lot of those CVs of failures that people have put out on Twitter and so on, and actually seeing people who you think are very successful and realizing that they've applied for a lot of grants and not got them. And I'm the same as Sarah. I've definitely applied for a huge amount more grants than I ever got. And I think it is important to think of the opportunity cost, as it is in any part of academic life, because you get lots of requests. You could be sort of doing it. You could be working all hours of every single day and night and still not finish your work. So it's very important to think about what you don't do as well as what you do. And making sure that the things that you do put your time and effort in are the most valuable. And sometimes, because grants take so much work, and you can do sometimes you can do things with them, sometimes you can't. It just depends. I mean, nothing is entirely wasted, but they're not as repurposable as papers, as I said before. So I think it is thinking seriously about what you do, and also being resilient and realizing that there are lots of good applications that never get funded, and there is a certain amount of luck. If you're in that fundable tranche, you may not get funded even though your proposal's excellent. So it is recognizing that, and that everyone goes through it. I doubt anyone's got every single grant they've applied for. And if they have, we don't want to hear from them, because that would be...
Yeah, we don't want to know these people. So I guess the last point that we wanted to reflect on, so, you know, the CV, the litany of failures, this no is exactly what I got last year from all but one funder. So some of you said, well, we need to do it as part of career development. We're encouraged to do it. Do we really have to write grants? And I think the answer to that question is partly going to depend on what you want to do with your career. If you have research that you really want to do and it's going to take money, you're going to have to apply for grants for it, or buy lots of lottery tickets. For many of us, the research that we do doesn't involve huge costs. So it might both be easy to bring in small amounts of money just to do our own, say, archival or documentary research, to do a bit of empirical research. So unlike in something like the biosciences, where the expectation is you assemble a big team of postdocs and technicians and you need a lot of money to run the animal house and so forth, A lot of bioethics and medical research doesn't need a huge amount of resource. But if you're in a career position and a trajectory where getting funding is seen as important, so for example, I'm in a medical school, and if you don't get any research funding, then they probably don't want you in their department, to be brutally honest. If you are in a more sort of standard humanities and social science department, funding is becoming more important. But I do know people, and I know at least one professor in a law school who I don't think has ever had a research grant. So it is possible to advance in some career paths without writing grants. Okay, so I think most of you will be at a stage where I hope we haven't put you off too much, and I don't think you should be saying, right, I'm only going to aim for the kind of career where I don't have to write grants. But do always think about what the pluses and minuses are of shaping your career in a particular way, either be it around I need to get research grants, or I'm just going to do my own research and bring the costs needed for that. We allowed a bit of time as well for questions, and we were hoping that this last reflective section would prompt people to open up a bit and share their own thoughts and experiences. How are people feeling about, some of you are thinking of embarking on grant writing. How are you feeling about it? Nervous, positive, unsure, excited? Do people have any other questions that they, nervous? Yeah, it's, the worst part is the waiting, I think anyway. You apply and you think you've done a good application, and then you have to wait for, research council standard periods are often 9 months before you find out. Oh, terrified. Then I hope we've not put you off too much. There is, it's not easy and you might not get it, but there's a lot of support. It is good experience to get. Your senior colleagues are there to support you. Your peers are there to discuss the ideas, help you out, bounce ideas off, read your work and tell you if it makes sense. Your research office is there to help with the nuts and bolts. Hard to be optimistic. Yeah, I think you've got to be you've got to be realistic about it. And that said, if I weren't a perpetual optimist, I probably would just stop applying, because you've got to be ready to deal with you might not get it. It is intimidating. I would start small. Andrew says, what's the best way to respond when you don't get any feedback? You can try and ask. Do you mean when you just don't hear for ages about what's happened? You can try and chase them up and say, hey, we were supposed to hear back on the results last month, what's going on? And probably what you will get is, look, it's been a hold-up. The COVID rapid response grants that the calls came out last year, they promised they'd turn around within a month. I had one take 5 months to get back, which we did get, and the other one took, I think, 8 months to get back. And by that time, we'd pretty much gone, we know we're not getting it, but can you just at least officially tell us? So, often the more disappointing thing is that you get the result and you didn't get it, but you don't get feedback, or you don't get really useful feedback as to why. And honestly, that's probably not something they're going to come back to you on. They get what they get from the reviewers, they send that to you, and the funding bodies are not going to be able to give you any further information. So, I mean, what could you do? If you had people internally peer review it for you, they're probably your more useful sources. You take your colleagues for a coffee and say, that application of mine that you read, did you have anything else you wanted to say about it? Tips for writing grants. Lucy, do feel free, by the way, just to jump in, I think.
Yeah, I think sometimes, I think sometimes you don't get feedback from the funder, or very useful feedback. But if you do get feedback, it's always worth thinking about it, and really, rather than dismissing it and thinking, oh, they didn't understand. I mean, a common thing is to think they didn't understand what I was trying to do. Well, if they didn't understand what you were trying to do, then that was a flaw in your application. So I think it's just like feedback on anything. It's taking it on board and getting the most out of it. And if there is some feedback that you think isn't very useful, then ignore that. But as much feedback as you can get, the better, I think. But sometimes particularly if you're unsuccessful, you often don't get very much feedback for some schemes.
Yeah, Alana has a really important practical question, actually. Tips for writing grants without a university or research office. How do you do it as an independent researcher, especially if you're an ECR moving between contracts? You'll very rarely be applying for funding for your next post. So let's say a postdoctoral fellowship, for example, without a university or research office to help out. And the reason is that when you apply for that kind of funding, you have to say where you're going to host it. You have to say, I'm going to do 3 years postdoc at the University of Edinburgh, supervised by Professor Anne-Marie Farrell, and then you would work with the Edinburgh Research Office and your sponsor at the institution who will supervise your fellowship for them to handle it. So you basically can't write a postdoctoral fellowship that doesn't have an institution to support it. For other sorts of grants, I mean, you generally have to have an academic body to administer it. I don't know of any examples really. Oh, I suppose the Nuffield Council, it has its own sort of, yeah, mostly work with your research office. Even if you're on a short-term contract and you're applying for something that's going to happen next year and your contract runs out, as long as it doesn't require institutional resource, you can still be supported to do that through your research office as long as the funding can come directly to you. So there are some travel grants, for example, that pay directly to the recipient, but mostly it's paid through a university and supported by them. Okay, I think we are at time. I'm just keeping an eye. Yeah, we're just on 11 now.
Yes, there was one question, how long to put together I mean, sometimes it's a bit of a how long is a piece of string, but I think because those have deadlines, don't they? I think you should at least get a sense from your research office how long it would take them to process the costings and the sign-offs at least. But I think you're probably looking at probably a good 6 months in advance of the deadlines. And some calls have rolling deadlines. So you can think, okay, you might see a call and think, I'm not going to do it, be able to do it in 2 months, but I can apply for the next round. And that, I think if there's a scheme you like, you can start thinking about, that's the other important thing quickly to add is planning. So you can think, okay, so sometimes the Nuffield and the Leverhulme particularly have annual competitions. Bearing in mind funders do change all the time. So what you might have found out a couple of years ago has changed. But you can have some sense of deadlines coming up and planning. So you're not always thinking, oh, I've just seen that and there's only 2 weeks to go. So it's good getting a kind of funding calendar in mind.
Mm-hmm. For the welcome scheme specifically as well, there's only one call for that per year as far as I'm aware, and they look at them in the May round, and I think you've got to have it submitted, I think it's in March. So I think 6 months ahead of that. Ted also posted a question about peer review comments, which I'll just very quickly answer and then we'll wind up. Would we approach peer review comments on the grant similarly to on a paper? I am politer when I respond to peer review comments on a grant. So I'm usually polite anyway, but sometimes reviewers can be, reviewer 2 is the typical horrible reviewer. Sometimes if I've received what I consider to be a rude review, I will write to the editor and say, I don't think that was appropriate. You can't really do that for a grant. So usually what they'll have raised will either indicate that you didn't explain something well enough and you can explain it better, or it will indicate that there's some other issue that you can actually address. So peer review on grants is also very helpful, as well as in response to papers. Okay, we must wind up, but I just wanted to say thanks again. Thanks to all of you. Thanks to Ted and to the organisers for putting together this great event. I'm happy as well if people have other questions that they think of later or would like some advice. I'm happy to be contacted. I haven't got my email up there, but I'm sure it could be in the programme or sent out, or it's just sarah.chan@ed.ac.uk.
Yes, likewise. Yes, thank you, and thanks for inviting us. Hope that was useful and not to put you all off.
Yes, and good luck. Good luck with your next application, whatever it may be.
Thank you both very much, Sarah and Lucy, for that fantastic opening session this morning. I think participants are rightly thanking you very much for your excellent tips and advice about navigating what is a complex and often very stressful part of an academic career, but a vital one. So Thank you very much indeed for that. Colleagues, participants, we have about 10 minutes for a break before we move to our fourth and final session, led by Mary Guy and Simon Wood. So can I suggest we have a virtual round of applause for Lucy and Sarah again for that. Thank you. And we'll reconvene in about 12 minutes time at 11:15 UK time. So see you all back here in 12 minutes.